Welcome to Woodbury Writes Podcast. I'm your host, Sandy Carlson, and I'm here today with Bruce Coffin of Hamden, Connecticut and Woodstock, Vermont. Bruce is the author of Among Familiar Shadows and The Long Light of Those Days, two memoirs about growing up in Vermont. Bruce is a longtime teacher at Westover School in Middlebury, Connecticut, as well as other independent schools. Welcome to the podcast, Bruce.
Glad to be here.
Thank you for taking the time to meet with us and talk about your upcoming conversation at the library about British poet Philip Larkin. Would you introduce Philip Larkin to our listeners?
Yes, Larkin's dates are August 9th, 1922 to December 2nd, 1985. And by the time of his death in 85, he was unquestionably England's unofficial poet laureate, their best loved poet since the war. And he's now recognized as one of England's greatest 20th century poets. He was born and raised in Coventry, educated at a grammar school there, went to Oxford where he earned a first in English in 1943 during the war, although he wasn't drafted because he didn't pass the physical. And he spent the rest of his life in a series of jobs as a librarian, most importantly at the University of Hull in Yorkshire. He gained a reputation as the reputation of a recluse. In Martin Amos's words, quote, "War, travel, marriage, children, none of this happened to him," end quote. He elected to live in a nondescript industrial city in the north of England, far away from the London literary establishment. He wanted at first to be a novelist, and he wrote two novels in the 1940s, the second of which, A Girl in Winter, really ought to be read. It's a magnificent book. But when he was unable to finish a third novel, he turned to poetry. And he wasn't a prolific writer. He produced only 4 small volumes of poetry during his lifetime, one about every 10 years.
How did he become the most beloved poet in Britain in the post-war years with such a slim canon of work?
He spoke directly to the people, readers of all sorts, in a way that modern poets, or the poets that are classified as modern poets, didn't. And Larkin had very serious thoughts about this. He was considered to belong to a group of writers called the Movement, and they were anti-modernists. They dealt with the problems of modern people. The Movement established a strong relationship between poet and reader. His two charges against modern poetry, and when I say modern poetry, I'm referring in particular to that generation of which T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound were the best known poets, and you could add the American poet Wallace Stevens to that as well. But his charges against that modernist school was that they'd severed the connection between artist and audience, and that they'd substituted book knowledge for lived experience in the making of their poems. Modern poetry was written for academics, for highly educated people. Movement poetry was for the layman. It spoke of the common problems of everyday people. And the other important thing here, I think, was Larkin always said that the most important element in poetry is feeling. And the movement poets favored emotion over intellect, and traditional forms over free verse. And it brings, one of the great things about movement poetry is that it brings elegance and colloquial ease and precision back into the currency of the language. And I can, if you'd like, I can illustrate what this poetry sounds like by reading a couple of short poems. Actually, the two of Larkin's poems which best illustrate movement characteristics are The Whitsun Weddings and a poem called Church Going, but they're long, and I'd rather save them for the reading on January 14th. But there are 3 poems, actually two two poems here that will serve pretty well. One of them is called Talking in Bed. It's a very short poem, and you'll see what I mean by the precision and the colloquial ease of the verse. Talking in bed. Talking in bed ought to be easiest. Lying together there goes back so far, an emblem of two people being honest. Yet more and more time passes silently. Outside the wind's incomplete unrest bills and disperses clouds about the sky, and dark towns heap up on the horizon. None of this cares for us. Nothing shows why at this unique distance from isolation it becomes still more difficult to find words at once true and kind, or not untrue and not unkind.
I see what you mean about that contemporary idiom. It rings true now and is every bit accessible and relatable. That idea, the dark town heaping up on us. Wow.
I know it's marvelous. There's a visionary aspect to Larkin's poetry which breaks through at the oddest moments in his work, and there's a wonderful lyricism to it as well. And that would be illustrated in a poem called The Trees. The trees are coming into leaf, like something almost being said. The recent buds relax and spread. Their greenness is a kind of grief. Is it that they are born again and we grow old? No, they die too. Their yearly trick of looking new is written down in rings of grain. Yet still the unresting castles thresh in full-grown thickness every May. Last year is dead, they seem to say, begin afresh, afresh, afresh.
Nice, and I see what you mean about the form, the rhyme, and the lyricism really give dignity to ordinary experience instead of leaving the listener behind in some kind of morass of intellectualism.
Yes, mythological allusions and references to other works in the Western canon that people can be trusted to recognize instantly.
Right.
And all it does is send you to the library to look up all those allusions. That's what you were doing with T.S. Eliot. Not that I don't like Eliot, but
true, and feeling somewhat inadequate as a reader if it doesn't resonate or you can't find the allusions. You know.
Yeah, that's right. I know. And there's one more poem of his, if I could read it,
please.
Which is recognized as the first poem of Larkin's mature period. Just as a bit of background here, it was inspired by a film he saw about a famous racehorse of the 1930s, which had been retired and put out to pasture. And this is called At Grass. And you'll see the preference for form here over free verse, and also the wonderful lyricism of these lines. Long after you've read them, they hum about your ears, you know. Somebody said, what's the true test of a lyrical poet? Well, it's just, the lines that stay with you. You don't know you have them, and all of a sudden, long after you read the poem, there they are. You discover you've still got them somewhere. All right, right with you. This is called At Grass. The eye can hardly pick them out from the cold shade they shelter in, till wind distresses tail and mane. Then one crops grass and moves about, the other seeming to look on, and stands anonymous again. Yet 15 years ago, perhaps, 24 distances sufficed to fable them. Faint afternoons of cups and steaks and handicaps, whereby their names were artificed to inlay faded classic Junes. Silks at the start, against the sky, numbers and parasols. Outside, squadrons of empty cars and heat and littered grass, then the long cry hanging unhushed till it subside to stop press columns on the street. Do memories plague their ears like flies? They shake their heads. Dusk brims the shadows. Summer by summer all stole away, the starting gates, the crowds and cries, all but the unmolesting meadows. Almanac, their names live. They have slipped their names, and stand at ease, or gallop for what must be joy, and not a field glass sees them home, or curious stopwatch prophecies. Only the groom and the groom's boy with bridles in the evening come.
Wow, that is stunning. I love that phrase, dusk brims the shadows, and
Yeah.
and slipping their names, the freedom of that. Wow.
Yeah, the way you slip a bridle or something, And my students love that. The dusk brims the shadows. And what he's up to is pretty apparent there. I mean, you don't have to, go researching it or anything like that. All the vocabulary is recognizable, comes from common parlance. But, it's his poems have attracted so much attention. Only the groom and the groom's boy with bridles in the evening come. The sounds of those vowels in there, as though it's soothing. These are people who really care about them, who are taking care of them. We're assured at the end of the poem, the groom and the groom's boy with bridles in the evening come, as though they were saying something soothing to them. And people have gone so far as to say, oh, those vowels, ooh, ooh, those are the drums at the beginning of Purcell's Requiem for Queen Mary. Something. Larkin's being taken very seriously, And I love that kind of criticism. I don't think it's not, of course, that Larkin may have intended any of that, but I'm sure he would have assured us that he hadn't. But at the same time, he was a great music listener, and I'm sure he would have been familiar with Purcell's Requiem. So who knows?
Right.
Yeah.
So Bruce, tell us what mark did he and the movement leave on the world of poetry?
Well, there weren't any other poets there in the movement. I'm trying to think who they were. D.J. Enright, Donald Davy, Kingsley Amos, a couple of other names are escaping me at the moment, were nowhere as near as accomplished as Larkin. But Larkin didn't consider himself part of anybody's school of poets, or I don't think. But he's the one that continues to receive the most attention of any of them. And to judge by the activities of the Philip Larkin Society and the great number of books and articles about him, there's something like a small literary industry.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, that sprung up. It seems as though everybody is reading Larkin now. In April of 2012, the Poetry Society of America and Cooper Union in New York presented a tribute to Philip Larkin, in which 20 British and American poets and writers read from his works. And they included American poet Billy Collins, New Yorker writer Adam Gopnik, novelist Zadie Smith, and even pop star Paul Simon.
Oh, wow.
Everybody's reading him. And it was a packed house. And, there are a number of great American poets, every bit as good as Larkin. Richard Wilbur, for instance, and Howard Nemeroff. And they're contemporaries of his. They were born within 2 years of each other. And they've not been lauded in this way, at least not yet. And I quote here Philip Hobsbawm, an English critic, who says, and I quote, "The major reason for Larkin's hold over his readers is his ability to see the same subject in different terms." That's a line from his poem, The Whitsun Weddings. His ability to change perspectives. His poems, Hobsbawm says, are adventures in feeling and experiencing, end quote. I really like that, that estimation. There's such a wide range of mood in Larkin, and an enlargement of vision that's there in poem after poem. And Hobsbawm again, Larkin, quote, is most himself when creating out of unlikely materials an unforeseen beauty, which is not in the subject, but in the lilt of the verse. And that takes up Larkin's lyricism. And the other thing about Larkin is he can be very funny. There's a lot of humor and a lot of curmudgeonry in his verse and in his letters. There's a 600 or 700 page selection of his letters edited by Anthony Thwaite that I would highly recommend. I'll go back to them again. I've read them twice. I know I'm going to go right back into them. My impulse when I get to the end of that great big book is to turn around and start it again. It's always interesting to read Larkin's prose because there's so little of it. There were 2 books, Required Writing and More Required Writing, which is a composite of reviews that he wrote, book reviews that he wrote, interviews that he gave, although there weren't very many of those, and things of that sort. And he's a beautiful prose writer. Be sure to read A Girl in Winter, which is a wonderful book of his 2 novels.
Got it. So Bruce, would you tell us about your reading with your former colleague from Westover at Woodbury Public Library on January 14th?
Yeah.
What can we expect then?
Well, we will take a cue from the 2 times that Larkin, 2 or 3 times that Larkin ever read his poems. And he didn't read them at any public gathering. He read them because he was being recorded. And what he liked to do was make some short comments for each poem. So we'd be not all the poems, and we won't be doing it for all the poems, but for most of them anyway. We're selecting 20 poems the way they did it at Cooper Union, introducing each one of them in some way, perhaps. There'll be time, I suppose, at the end for questions and comments. I was delighted when Chris Sweeney, my fellow reader, agreed to do it, because with the possible exception of Richard Wilbur, who we got to Westover a number of times, Chris is probably the best poetry reader I have ever heard. And so it's a great treat for me. It's intimidating to have to read with him, but it's a great treat for me to hear him once again. We've only done it once, and it seemed to work pretty well, so we're trying to continue, even though the Larkin centennial will formally be over at the end of the year.
Well, that's great. So it'll be Philip Larkin at 100+1.
Yes.
Poetry reading in celebration of the life and work of Philip Larkin, presented by Bruce Coffin with Christopher Sweeney, January 14th, 2023, at the Woodbury Public Library. All are welcome, and it sure sounds like it's going to be a very lively and engaging experience for everybody who attends. So thanks for bringing that to Woodbury, Bruce.
Thank you very much. I look forward to it.